A woman struck by lightning. The Lord will rescue his servants. No one who takes refuge in him will be condemned. Psalm 34:22. 30 years ago, I married a public officer. My husband's monthly salary was too insufficient to provide for our two sons and make a living, as the money would have already run out 1 week after payday. I, therefore, began to think of a way to make money. I tried out quite a few different jobs, which wouldn't interfere with my life of faith. As a result, I realized the perfect job that suited my personality and aptitude was that of a realtor. As I began working as a realtor, I wished to make just enough money to be able to give a monthly tithe of 100,000 Korean won, which is 100 US dollars. Surprisingly, I made more money than I had expected. And of course, I began to give a bigger amount of tithe than I originally had imagined. However, when the amount of yearly tithe broke the 10 billion Korean won, which is $10,000 line, I changed my mind. The amount was simply too big to give to God. Lord, I'm going to have to stop this for a while. I'll pay everything in a lump sum later. I stopped giving tithes. Selfishness began to bite into me. I had never handed a dime to beggars asking for money on the street or on the subways. I comforted myself, promising that I would provide help to those in need when I fill up my pocket first. Sometimes such selfish thoughts would scare me. Is it really okay to live like this? Will I be punished by God? The solution I had come up with in order to avoid God's punishment was to make my older son a pastor and provide him good support. With this motive, I drove my son to become a theology major at Samyang University. He was a good student, and I kept making good money. Everything seemed to be going smoothly. I proudly believed that God was pouring abundant blessings on me. In the second semester of his sophomore year in university, he joined the military for the compulsory service. Into the 18th month of his military service, he got a few days off and came home. The moment I looked at him, as he called out my name and walked into my office, I almost fainted. He was far from looking normal. He was a mere skeleton, a serious patient. I could almost see him falling and dying at the very moment. In utter shock, I immediately took him to the hospital. He was told that he had acute rectal cancer and that he could survive only 3 more months. Finally, I thought a curse had descended upon me. I believed that this was God's punishment on me. From that day, my son and I began a life or death war against cancer. Growing skinnier by the day, my son pleaded with me, "Mom, I don't want to die. Even if I can't fight off cancer, I still want to survive. Please help me." My heart was about to burst from pain as I listened to his plea. Fear of losing my son to death, and anger and the question as to why I should be the one suffering such a hardship drove me crazy. Unbearable rage surged up in my heart. I went into my bedroom and locked the door. I grabbed and smashed anything and everything in front of me as I wailed and mourned. I crushed pretty much everything in that room. I writhed and lashed out at the unfairness of this world. I yelled out at God. All I wanted to do was to raise my son well and make him your servant, Lord. Now, what have I done so wrong against you that you are punishing me so harshly? We tried in vain to cure him, and so my 24-year-old son died and was cremated. I completely hid from everyone around me what I believed was true, that my son's death was a punishment from God for my past mistakes. I always trembled with fear that anyone might find out about it. In order to escape from grief and anguish, I completely lost myself in making money. I never took a break or cared for my health. Even with financial success, my heart was in a death struggle because of the feeling of emptiness which frequently hit me. From deep down in my heart, a desire to go back to God arose. I hated myself for being such an extremely superficial churchgoer. It had been 8 years since my son died. Still, whenever I was reminded of him, I trembled like a leaf and couldn't hold back my tears. The wound in my heart was still raw. And by the most amazing guidance of God, I was led to the Bible study group at Seronam Church. The God I learned about there was completely different from the God I had known all this time. I realized that punishment for committing sin is actually learning about and feeling the pain of being separated from God and His Son Jesus. In other words, it was eternal death. I also learned that Jesus had borne that punishment of having to be separated from our Father God, the Creator of life, on behalf of me. I finally understood that my son's death was not due to my sins. It was because of the disease Satan had cast upon him. God hadn't punished me. What had happened to me was not a punishment from God. The moment I was enlightened to this truth, my soul finally was freed from the darkest dungeon. I was so shocked that I felt as though I was struck by lightning. Almost feeling like I had been shocked by electricity, I couldn't contain my tears from the overwhelming thankfulness and joy that I felt. I was so thankful and joyful for the fact that all my sins had been forgiven that I couldn't stop crying. My forgiven heart was filled with a heavenly peace which I had never experienced before. This peace let me feel the atmosphere of heaven, which is simply incomparable with the one of this world. I never wanted to lose this peace again. I wanted to keep it in my heart forever. In order to do that, I had to keep God as my number one priority. A huge battle broke out in my mind because of this priority issue. Since all this time, needless to say, my top priority had been making money. However, I could not serve two masters at the same time. Wealth, which I had considered the most important thing in the world, and God. The subtle yet clear voice of God, which kept ringing in my conscience, and the voice of the God of this world truly troubled me. I had been attending church only when my work schedule allowed. However, it was now time to make a decision. My top priority had to change. The fierce battle against selfishness began. With a determination as resolute as cutting off my own arm or even risking my life, I cried out my prayer to God. My decision to give up all the worldly things was as firm as a life or death battle. When I made up my mind to keep the Lord as my number one priority, the heavenly peace overwhelmed my heart. My fear for death, which had been distressing me all this time, vanished at once. The huge wound which had been nearly impossible to heal was now all cured and clean. The peace and love in my heart drove out selfishness. Surprisingly, my heart, once full of selfishness, was now filled with love for others. I genuinely empathized with the pain and sufferings others were experiencing, and wished to help them. There were a few people in my family whom I had been angry at and found it difficult to forgive. Now I began to think that I was the one with greater faults and had been hurting them even more. I took courage and asked them for forgiveness. In order to keep the relationship with God sound and right, I must ceaselessly choose Him, for only then can peace and joy remain in my heart at all times.